Good evening, everyone. My name is Sreenivasan. I'm a professor and dean of student affairs at the Journalism School at Columbia and co-founder of SAJA, the South Asian Journalists Association. In that capacity at SAJA, I have had a chance to follow closely the coverage of South Asia for many years, and I gather that's one of the reasons that I was offered the opportunity to participate today. It is my extreme honor to be your chair as well as moderator for this event. I'm a big admirer of these three men, and you're in for a real treat. You're going to learn a lot and have some fun. I'd like to start by thanking Rob Garris, Joan Crawford, Pat, and Stacy here at SIPA for making this possible. Let's give them a hand. The format for today is that I'll make a couple of quick remarks and introductions, and then we'll have some thoughts for about 15-20 minutes each from our speakers, and then we will maybe have a quick conversation up here and then throw it open to you all. And we want to give you as much time as possible to go through all the questions. We're very confident you have as much to say as we do about the topic. And the topic, of course, is India. And we're here in part to celebrate the publication of India, the Emerging Giant by Professor Arvind Panagariya. And this is really a landmark book. Professor Panagariya, as you know, is a professor of economics and the Jagdish Bhagwati Professor of Indian Political Economy here at Columbia and SIPA. And he has really gotten worldwide attention to this one book of his in a way that is very hard to imagine that a book could penetrate the worldwide kind of consciousness of people who are interested in India. I was going to read you from all the various reviews, but instead I'm going to read you just one line from one comment. Fareed Zakaria, the editor of Newsweek International and one of the most influential people in America today, had this to say. He said, "This book is now the definitive book on the Indian economy," and there's sort of no higher praise that you can imagine for this. And it really captures, in a sentence, this book, but you will hear a lot more from Professor Panagariya, so please welcome Professor Panagariya. The two gentlemen who are helping us here have the conversation are folks who are so well known in their own right that I will not try to introduce them at length, but just give you a couple of quick things. Professor Jagdish Bhagwati is the only person up here, and I presume in the room, who has a chair named after him at Columbia, so that should tell you plenty. And he is one of the very few university professors to have that title of university professor at Columbia is very rare. And he's also a senior fellow in international economics at the Council on Foreign Relations. And just to show you how the world operates now, at about 4:30, I posted on my Facebook status update, I said, I'm going to listen to Arvind Panagariya, Jagdish Bhagwati, and Tunku Varadarajan talk about India at 6. And within seconds, I got several emails from people, and a woman named Jen Chung, who runs one of the most influential websites about New York called Gothamist. I think some of you know it. She said, she posted on my status for the world to see, I took a class with Professor Bhagwati in 1998, and he's wonderful. And that just kind of tells you that you mention his name and people respond and people want to participate. So that was very nice, and that tells you kind of what kind of influence he has. So please welcome Professor Bhagwati. And our final speaker for today is Tunku Varadarajan, who wears dual hats as a journalist and as an observer of media, but also as a professor at NYU in the Stern School of Business. He was, until recently, the opinion page editor of the editorial features in the Wall Street Journal. And you can imagine that particular perch gave him an opportunity to publish some of the most widely read and highest impact editorials and op-ed pieces in recent years. He has, as part of his new job at NYU, left the Wall Street Journal, but continues to write there and does a series of wide-ranging interviews on various topics. but he's also now the new opinions editor of Forbes.com. And that's another place where he gets to curate, if you will, the essays and thoughts of very influential people from around the world, and has a chance to influence how people think. But he also got a chance just today to publish a piece by a 13-year-old journalist talking about Facebook, and that journalist was the son of Suketu Mehta, who many of you know, who wrote that kind of very definitive book about Mumbai, Maximum City. So all of this kind of ties together, and we're just very delighted to have Tunku with us as well. Please welcome Tunku. We're going to start by having Professor Panagariya talk a little bit about his work. From my perch at the journalism school, India has been a place of increasing interest, along, of course, with China. And a couple of years ago, I was able to teach a course with Professor Ari Goldman, who many of you know is a longtime New York Times reporter, about covering the religions of India. And seeing India through the eyes of my American students, we took about 16 students there, actually changed the way I looked at India. Among many things, you know that journalists and Indians and others are constantly complaining about every time an American reporter goes to India, they write a story about the first cow they see on the street, the first elephant, the first poor person they see, the first village they see. But it's very easy to complain, but seeing a lot of these things through the eyes of my students gave me an idea about how big a story this is becoming, and also how Americans are relating more and more to India. In subsequent years, there was another class that went to India, and in a sign of how things have changed so dramatically, last year we had no American students go to India to work. But this year, we've sent 12 people to work at the Hindustan Times, the Times of India, which you know is the world's largest English daily, and also the Economic Times. So those are 12 Americans leaving America instead of working in the American press. That kind of tells you how things are changing. I always feel when I'm with American journalists, we're at a funeral because of all the jobs lost and all the turmoil you keep hearing about. But when I look at the Indian media, the excitement level there is amazing. And part of that is covering the political economy of India, which, of course, is the focus of Professor Panagariya's book. So with that, we will give you plenty of chances to ask questions and make this as interactive as possible. But let's get right to the star of today, Professor Arvind Panagariya.
Thank you, Sri. Let me just join Sri in thanking Professor Bhagwati and Professor Varadarajan for joining this panel. And let me also applaud Professor Sreenivasan here. Nothing important on India happens in the New York City without Professor Sreenivasan being there. And if you go to an event on India and Professor Sreenivasan is not there, you should conclude it's not an important event. All right, so let me, I'm going to tell you a bit about the book, and also then a little bit about where India is today. Some thoughts on where I see it going, and then a little bit on what is India's challenge. This book really, in a way, tries to, at least pretends to succeed, a very famous book, perhaps, and this is a definitive book that was written, most comprehensive one and the most brilliant book, the book which actually is the intellectual, in a sense you could say it is really the intellectual source of the economic reforms in India today. This was the book that Bhagwati and Sreenivasan, Professor Bhagwati and Professor Padma Desai wrote in 1970. This was really, in those days, if you actually lived through India, you were virtually seen. I mean, the hold and the influence of the left was so dominant in India that you were practically on a fringe if you talked about liberalization. But so in this sense, that was also a very, very brave book. But above all, it was written with incredible amount of evidence and argumentation and analysis, and was very, very comprehensive. I don't think really anything. Several books came out in the subsequent, 2 or 3 decades, but nothing came close. This one tries to be comprehensive, at least in that respect. So I'll just quickly tell you, it's a comprehensive book. It starts out, part 1 deals with growth, and there I tell the full history. So now, it's a longer history than the time that Professor Bhagwati and Desai wrote the book. Since 1950, I began and come all the way to 2006. And it takes a full kind of view of what happened in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, why things went wrong, what did we not do right, then how things began to change in the 1980s, but really then Big Bang reform in 1991, and subsequent to that, then continuation of the reforms in a sort of stop-go fashion. Early 1990s, major reforms in the middle, then there is some slowdown. Late 1990s, starting with 1998, again, big reforms happen, continue for about almost 6 years. Come to 2004, again, there is slowdown. And currently, we are continuing into that slow phase, as it were. I attribute a lot of this acceleration of the growth that happened more recently, which I'll talk about right away, to these reforms that particularly happened between 1999 and 2004, which were, of course, themselves triggered by some things, by the reforms that happened in early 1990s. What I do is first, tell you a little bit about where the Indian economy currently is. So the current growth rate, if you take the last 5 years, I'm going to focus first at least on the more recent years. So if you take last 5 years, on the average in real rupees, the Indian economy has been growing at 9%. This is quite comparable to the Chinese growth rate. Now, prior to that, if you take a longer period from about, let's say, 1988, let's say, to 2008, so about 20-year period, you have a growth rate of about 6.6, 6.7%. So for 20 years, you have had a sort of steady growth of about 6.5%, and in the last 5 years, it has accelerated to 9%. There is a bit of debate on, whether this 9% is going to be sustained or not. I'll argue in a minute why I think it will sustain, actually, at least at that level, if not higher. But let me, before that, give you a few additional indicators of, what this growth has meant, and in what way can we see this growth manifest itself. So there are a lot of indicators one can look at, which kind of reinforce the big change that has happened. And as a trade economist, the first thing I like to look at is how is trade grown. And just one little statistic, trade to GDP ratio, this is, goods and services exported and imported, some of that as a proportion of the total income, the GDP. That in 1991, when the reforms were actually launched, the major reforms and systematic ones, was about 15% or 16%. Today, it has exceeded about 50%. So you can see that you're looking trade to GDP ratio. GDP itself has been growing at 9%. Trade has to be growing extremely rapidly for that ratio to actually be tripled. So it's a 300% expansion of trade to GDP ratio. That's one big indicator. And generally you look at most countries that have grown rapidly, that's one of the features, one of the things that happens, that trade grows rapidly and the economy looks more and more open as measured by trade to GDP ratio. On other indicators, you got direct foreign investment, early 1990s, take 1991, foreign direct investment into India was, or foreign investment together, meaning foreign direct investment plus the portfolio investment, was about, $200 million, $300 million, virtually, negligible. Today, it has been running at the rate of about, both portfolio and direct foreign investment together, about 25 to $30 billion, and it's sustaining at that level. That we may see some exodus currently as a result of the events on the Wall Street and all, but that would be a short-term event in my view. I think it's going to go back up. Remittances, which is another indicator, which is the funds that overseas Indians, people like me working here, remit back to the country. They used to be something like $2 to $3 billion in the early 1990s. Today, they're running at close to about $30 billion. Outward foreign investment also. Now, for a long time, Indian companies were really not allowed to invest abroad in a major way. There were lots of restrictions. Now, those restrictions have been largely lifted, and you see a big kind of spate of Indian companies acquiring overseas things like, Chorus being acquired by Tata and Arcelor being acquired by Mittal. Jaguar most recently was acquired by Tata. Tattly Tea was acquired by Tata. So there's a large number of these acquisitions happening by the Indian multinational companies. And for the last year that I have the numbers, the figure total acquisitions by the Indian companies exceeded about $30 billion. So that again is an indicator of the rapid changes that are happening. Software industry, of course, is a well-known story that started off. This is an industry that has moved very rapidly. If you go back to 1995, software exports out of India were less than $1 billion. Today, so what is it? 10 years later, they're about $40 billion. So going very rapidly, 25% or so per year, maybe a bit higher. So that's moving apace as well. Now, the biggest success story of these reforms, in my view, is the telecommunications. This is the sector, actually, which used to perform extremely poorly in India. I'll give you a couple of kind of quantitative and qualitative pieces of information, which will give you an idea, what it was like. We used to joke when in the 70s and even early 80s, how difficult it is to get the telephone. You stay in the queue, you apply for the telephone to the Department of Telecommunications, wait for 3 or 4 years, you get your telephone, pick up the phone, you'll not get the dial tone half of the time, and the other half of the time you'll get the dial tone, you dial, but you'll get the wrong number. That's this kind of, quality of service was so poor. But quantity-wise also, come all the way to 1991, so you got 40-year period from 1950 to 1991. Total telephone lines during this period that were added, full stock of telephone lines was about 5 million. Today, so there's a big reform actually, through 1990s, several reforms happened, but the big reform happened in the early 2000s, and that really kicked off the growth. So today, India is adding every month about 9 million telephone lines. Remember, 9 million per month being added compared to 5 million of the total stock of 40 years by the year 1991. So this is something that has really led to a huge amount of internal transformation. I mean, in the same way that trade kind of is transforming externally, internally the telecommunications, and particularly the spread of telephone, is really transforming, because this is something that can be used to enhance productivity from all the way into agriculture to industry to the software industry. You can go the entire spectrum. And today, the tele density itself, number of telephones per 100, which used to be only like below 3 in 1998, today it is about 30. So, 3 in 10 are holding a cell phone in their hands or a fixed line phone. So that really is an amazing transformation. Also, let me say on automobile sector, that's another one which has done extremely well. Today, India is producing over about 1.5 million automobiles, and largely being sold on the domestic market. So you can see, every 6 months you go to India, you can see the difference, and that in spite of huge amount of road construction going on, even in a city like Delhi, you'll see, that density of cars is actually rising. And so that's another indicator. Last one I'll mention, actually, this is Tunku's Forbes.com does the list of billionaires, and last one was done for India in November 2007. There were 54 billionaires in India, actually. That's more than what Japan had and more than what China had. Now, I'm sure, with the stock market having tanked a bit, there are fewer, but still, 54, even if you turn that into half, 27 would be a very large number for a country like India, where, there were hardly any billionaires if you go 10 years ago. So certainly, there's a big change, big transformation. Now, the obvious question you'd ask is, what has happened to poverty? I mean, is this growth, the sectors I named to you look very much, where maybe the middle class and the upper class are being helped. So one has to look back as to what has happened to the poor in India. Now, the story exactly what has happened is a bit more complicated, which I'll not try to tell you, but numbers are there. And so there is a long chapter in my book, chapter 7, which is on poverty, and it's another chapter, chapter 8, on inequality. And that documents actually, and there is no question, you can fight about the numbers, how much reduction has happened, but the fact that a significant reduction in poverty has happened during the last 20 years is really not contestable. The official figures I'll tell you, so to give you some idea that the number of people, the head count ratio as it is called, the number of people living below the poverty line as a proportion of the total population was about 46% in 1983. Now it's down to about 27%. So there has been a very substantial decline. And poverty, as I said, depending on how you want to count, etc., these numbers may look a little different, but you cannot get anything less than a very significant reduction in poverty in the data. Inequality, that's a big issue actually politically. I take a skeptical view of it in the sense that this is I would the inequality, the way I would like to fight is by fighting the poverty, meaning if you focus on states that are really poor like Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, where the bulk of the poor are located, in effect you would actually also be fighting inequality. But beyond that, if you try to fight inequality, I think you can very easily compromise your growth, which in the end is going to compromise the poverty alleviation as well. So this is regional. Inequality, if you take nationally as measured by the Gini coefficient, is really not changed very much at all in India. But if you look at regional inequality, by state level incomes, etc., or you look urban-rural, that certainly has gone up. But again, that's where I argue actually in chapter 8 of the book that that's not something we really need to lose a lot of sleep over. Now the issue I want to address is this growth going to sustain? And I argue actually in the book, and I've been arguing this, that yes, this growth is actually going to sustain for a number of reasons. Now, if you visit India, if you look at India, there are lots of inefficiencies. And so it's very easy to come up with this impression that, how can this growth be sustained? So much is wrong with India. But ultimately, I think you need to look at whether the change is happening or not, and where India came from and where it is. And where it is, I think currently, there are good reasons. Let me just mention 3 or 4 of the reasons. One is clearly that the economy is far more open today. Externally, but internally also. The way I like to put it is that, look, you've got to give the entrepreneurs the space to carry out their entrepreneurial activity. Now, for a long time, India's entrepreneurs were really very much suppressed. Nani Palkewala, who was a lawyer, used to say in the 1980s that, India's entrepreneurs are really top class. It's not easy to suppress them, but boy, our bureaucrats have got the talent to do it. But that hand of the bureaucrat has been now lifted off, and the entrepreneurs are much freer. So that's one reason I think, in terms of the efficiency, in terms of productivity, etc., things look good. Now, also in terms of, growth also depends not purely on how productivity grows, but also on how the input, labor and capital that you're employing are growing. Now, on capital side, India's savings rate has really been rising, is quite high now. Even within last 7 or 8 years, it has gone up from something like 22 to 23% to about 34%. So currently, this is savings as a proportion of the GDP. Today is 34% in India and still rising. And there are good reasons actually. For example, corporate savings in India is still about 8 or 9% compared to 25% plus in China. So India's corporate savings will never go to Chinese level, but certainly there is a lot of scope still left for corporate savings to grow. So I think savings rate will still continue to grow, and that is one of the inputs, meaning how rapidly you accumulate capital determines your growth rate. So doing well on that. Demography, again, labor, right? So is labor going to grow? And here again, India is a young nation today compared to most other nations, and actually all demographic projections are that India is going to grow younger, and actually relative to the other countries in the world, it's going to grow much younger. That again, what that tells you is that number of workers, number of those working as a proportion of total population will be growing. That by itself means higher output, but it also means that when you got a larger proportion of the population working, they save more. So savings rate again on that account can rise as well. So for all of those reasons, I think the growth rate will be sustained. India could do a lot better. I think, in my judgment, it can easily, given how much inefficiencies still exist in the system, push this growth rate to about 11 or 12%. That's not very difficult. The issue is whether the reforms that are required will happen or not. Very quickly, last 3 minutes I'll take to say what I think is India's big challenge right now going forward next 10, 15 years. Even now, one of the things that has not happened in India is a very rapid growth of labor-intensive manufacturing. Manufacturing in general has not done very well, but labor-intensive manufacturing, meaning apparel, footwear, toys, light consumer goods, all the products that employ a lot of workers have not done very well. And what that has meant is that in terms of drawing population out of agriculture into alternative employments, the movement has been relatively slow. So some movement has happened, but still, if you account for also the population increase and therefore increase in the workforce, still in India, the worker to land ratio on the farms has been marginally increasing. So about 3/5 of India's workforce, about let's say 55 to 60% of India's workforce is still in agriculture. Agriculture, on the other hand, contributes only 16% of the income. So you got 55% of the workforce there living on only 16% of the income. That's just and when the economy itself is growing at 9%, is a problem. What India needs to transform rapidly by pulling the workers from the land, from farming, into the gainful employment, such as industries and services. And in particular, I think the engine for that has to be partially, at least, the labor-intensive manufacturing, which has to do well. Therefore, the issue is why labor-intensive manufacturing is not doing well. Well, there were a lot of restrictions on industry. Many of these have now been lifted, but there is a big one still remaining, and that has to do with the labor markets. In India, if you are a firm with 100 workers or more, you are simply not allowed to fire workers, and even if you go bankrupt, actually, you still have to pay the workforce. So it's a very draconian sort of law, which then discourages large-scale labor-intensive manufacturing. So you can see, it's not comparison with China, but even if you compare with Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, if you look at the apparel firms comparison, Indian firms in apparel sector are smaller, way smaller than those in Bangladesh or in Sri Lanka. And of course, they are way, way smaller than in China. And labor laws have a lot to do with that. So that's one area that needs fixing. And I think there is also, and there is a lot of infrastructure in general. I take a generally optimistic view that, as far as the transportation infrastructure, roads, air transportation, ports, etc., railways, all that, I think there is bottlenecks right now, but in next about 10 years, they will all be, I think, solved. The formula there is known. The big sector where the bottlenecks are not going to be easy to solve, and that's where India needs to work on further reforms, is the power sector. That's where progress has been slow, and that is also a very tough economic reform. So those are the two really areas where I would focus the efforts. There's going to be an election in another year, will be new government, and so all eyes are on that, whether the new government that comes in is going to go back to accelerating the process of reforms. Thank you.
Professor Panagariya's father had called him in on just the week of Christmas of 2005 and said to him in his last final phone call that they ended up having, he said, take your time, but write a definite book on India, and the definitive book on India, and that's really what he's done, as you will see. I hope, just to remind everyone that we do have copies of the book on sale, and he will sign that for you. But now let's move on to the conversation. I know Professor Bhagwati is ready to provide some comments.
Well, so many of the students here have heard me all the time on subjects like this that the only way I could say something original was to say, it's a lousy book. But I won't do that because it's a terrific book. It's really beautiful. And once there was a famous pianist, a prodigy performing on the stage, and then one violinist, turned to the pianist and said, you must be feeling hot, and I'm not, because the violinist doesn't have to compete with the pianist. And I think I'm glad he's a different generation. I can only rejoice in his success instead of feeling threatened. Well, it's a fantastic book, and I urge you to read it. And it's actually an encyclopedia in a way, because every chapter is sort of self-contained. And whatever you want to read about, virtually anything you can think of is there and discussed in with enormous sophistication. So you don't have to read all of it. If you do, you would be a bit perverse, actually. It's a very big book. But I think each chapter will repay, a great deal of scrutiny. All I can say is to take a slightly historical perspective on where we are at, because I think Professor Panagariya gave you a lot of interesting detail. But let me just say that what has happened, in India is that we were basically in a stagnant mode until the reform started, most dramatically in '91 when we had a balance of payments crisis. That started a little bit earlier because nothing is ever that sharp a break. Right? So there were elements of change which are going on. But basically, the approach we had undertaken, the philosophy of how to approach poverty, which has always been there. I mean, even before I went back in 1961, in the first 5-year plan, which was 5 years before that, you read the chapters, in the plan. And poverty reduction, of course, is the main thing. You go back to the pre-independence, statements of all the leaders who were fighting for independence. They are talking about poverty because, India and China also, specialize in poverty. They have comparative advantage in poverty. So you can't ignore it. You've got to be a crazy person, totally blind. There are such people, but, who, to think that poverty reduction is not an objective. A lot of people go around who specialize in poverty and say, we ignored poverty. It's crazy. That's all I can say. We did not ignore poverty, but we didn't have an impact on poverty. Why? Because our policy framework was wrong. The main approach, when I say main, quite properly, we had land reforms, we had interventions in health and education. You name it, and the Indians have thought about it, unfortunately, even before I was there. Everything is there. But then why didn't we have any results? What was the problem? Because the main strategy was to have rapid growth and pull people out of poverty into gainful employment in a sustainable way. I'm not talking about the American election now, but I'm talking about an India which has enormous pools of poverty. And large numbers of underemployed people, some unemployed, who had to be brought out of this. So it wasn't a trickle-down strategy the way people, coming from American or Thatcher or Reagan model, they think of it as a passive strategy. We're all growing and we are sort of, eating legs of mutton at the table like in Hollywood movies about, Robin Hood and so on. And, having a great time. Then some crumbs are falling to the dogs and the serfs underneath the table. Well, that's not really it was not that kind of strategy. It was an activist pull-up strategy. So, I've always called it pull-up, not trickle-down. And it was a very radical strategy, very rapid growth and doing everything necessary in order to, create jobs. And actually, the other day in the New York Times, there was a story by Someni Sen Gupta on the Dalits who are the untouchables. And there was this guy, who was talking about how, I think it was a one-page story, how having been able to participate in the growth process, he'd managed to get out of the village and get out of the feudal structure and so on. So it was a very interesting, sort of micro example of the kind of thing we had in mind. But the problem was we didn't have the growth. Therefore, we didn't have the impact on poverty because a policy framework to produce the growth was just the wrong one. And we, took us about 30 years to discover that. I mean, some of us, like me and Professor Desai, we wrote about it, fairly dramatically at one time. We were immediately dismissed as, reactionary, sort of, like we were Mrs. Palin kind of people. I mean, that's quite a stretch. But, we just stuck to our guns, and then 25 years later, it was all being done. And so we had and this is why, economists usually get things wrong, as you know. In this case, we were right. And once we changed the policy framework, we got the very rapid growth, and we've had an impact on poverty. So I'll just come to that in a second. But just to say, what is it, the three elements of a frame? And this, I think, applies, with this crazy idea of the so-called Washington consensus, which is really a ridiculous one. I mean, I don't know what, they have exchange rates, sliding rates, and gliding rates. And I mean, who has ever agreed on macroeconomics? If you have found that consensus anywhere, please come and tell me. How can that be part of a Washington consensus? It's just some of the things which people in Washington were talking about. And it's a Washington conceit to think that some of the better ideas there were sort of discovered by Washington. They were discovered because they were discovered elsewhere. And then they came to Washington. If Washington has ever invented something, again, I would like you to let me know. So it is, again, as I said, a simple conceit. We actually, with our own experience, arrived at, in many of the developing countries, at these kinds of reforms. So there were three things, I would say, if I was looking back, and that really, I think Indian experience speaks to. One is a knee-jerk intervention everywhere in the economy. It doesn't make much sense. For one thing, we don't have the bureaucratic resources. Forget about the wisdom, all right? So we just don't have that. And therefore, to say that the government must enter every market is crazy. Once I gave an after-dinner speech, and I said the problem with many of the developing countries at that time was the fact that Adam Smith's invisible hand was nowhere to be seen. Now, that was a problem. Extensive knee-jerk intervention. So it was on the left, which where many of us were at that time. Then we had completely inward-looking policies. We weren't willing to take advantage of the international economy in any way. And so that, too, when 91 reform started in India, the direct foreign investment was, I looked up the figure, it was $100 million worth of equity. I don't know if you've seen the size of India, actually, on a map. And that's big. That's less than the budget, I think, of maybe SIPA, but certainly of Columbia University. I hope it is. But that was really, if that wasn't autarky on inward investment, I don't know what is. And the share of trade to GNP, which is one kind of index, had actually gone down almost uniquely in India and also in many other countries which are following that model. So we were kind of, at another extreme on that issue. And the third was public sector enterprises. We just were proliferating them everywhere. And that was probably a peculiar Indian, Egyptian, Ghanaian kind of model. And that's where, again, we were, getting into a whole lot of inefficiencies. So we changed that. And that really made me enter a new era. All right? Now, that is the two comments. One is my good friend, Professor Stiglitz. I don't know whether he considers me a good friend, but I certainly consider him to be my good friend because we disagree fundamentally on so many things. And he has no experience of developing countries, I'm sorry to say. Because, you can't be growing up in this country and really have a sense. So he really thinks that all these moves which we were making, which were really from an ideological position on the left, which I also was part of when I went back from England, we were moving towards the center. And he thought that we were moving from the center towards the right-wing, libertarian kind of thing, which is completely wrong. So we were we were pragmatic, moving towards a very different view of where we wanted to go, and not really going after the other extreme, as he often argues, what he calls market fundamentalism, which is a fundamental fallacy, in my opinion, because the guy has no clue as to what he's talking about, right? Because it just doesn't fit. And he talks only to left-wing guys who, of course, regret the whole fact that, you know, their whole model has disappeared down the tubes. And so I think that is really not, I mean, if you're in SIPA, you want to be sure that you challenge him. Okay. Now, a lot of leftists in India think they haven't gotten off the bus. They're still on the bus, you know that. And in many countries they are. And they think they're Rosa Parks, you know, sitting in the bus. Actually, they're just a bunch of lazy bums, actually, who have never changed their mind in light of experience at all. So that's... Now, I would say, with all of this wrong policies, you can still have 10, 15 years of very rapid growth and even impact on poverty. The question is whether it's sustainable, right, over a longer period. Because take the Soviet Union, very heavy rate of investment, closed economy, and certainly politically also no lack of democracy. What did they do? For about 20 years, they had very rapid growth. If you go and look at the chart, then it began to come down. And then, then perestroika came and then they crashed into the negative growth rates. So so if you want sustainable results, don't be misled by somebody saying, oh, in the last 10 years, Latin America has done much better by moving backwards on these things. Well, maybe, it's possible. Just look a little closer to see whether it's sustainable. And I tell the story of Mrs. Robinson, who was my radical teacher in Cambridge, and she was a great admirer of China and North Korea and so on. China in those days, all right? And then Gus Ranius, who was at Yale, a mainstream economist, or a neoliberal, as we are condemned, but mainstream economist. And so I overheard both of them arguing many decades ago, about 3 decades ago. Both of them were agreeing that Korea was a great example of, success. And then it turned out that she was talking about North Korea and he was talking about South Korea. Now we know which is a sustainable one, right? Okay? So don't be misled by, even 10, 15 years worth of. You have to probe it further. You may come to a different conclusion, but that's really what you need to do. We therefore change, and the poverty has actually diminished in a big way. And now where are we at right now? Okay, so we know there's a big debate now in India, again, about whether, why the Congress Party, for instance, won the last election. Because the thesis was on the part of the Congress, and I think Professor Stepan knows much more about the election than I do, but I'll still open my mouth by also saying, quoting him rather favorably, so he's bribed into silence. Essentially, the two hypotheses. One is that poverty has declined, and we know that for a fact. All the data show that poverty has declined substantially. I think the average figure is about 200 million in the last decade or so. Still a lot of poverty, still there. And if we had only done the right policies 30 years earlier, we would have had a bigger impact. But that's water under the bridge. All right. So now you have, where Professor Stepan, I think, has done this very interesting work, he's gone and actually asked people, right, with some Indian counterparts, and said, have you become better off in your own terms, in your own evaluation? And what, about 60% say, yes, they have. And they're asked, and this is in the rural areas as well, and they're asked, what about the next 5 years? Do you expect to improve yourself? And I think it's a somewhat similar figure. So in terms of people's own perceptions, they do see that there's some change for the better. Now, if that is your hypothesis, that's really what's happening, then it's an interesting contrast also with China, in the sense that what you have is, in India, people are feeling better, beginning to be better, because poverty has been declining. So their aspiration levels will probably increase. So like Oliver Twist, you may want to go ahead and ask for more, but Oliver Twist got less He didn't get more. But the Indian peasant who has a right to vote, he's going to try and turn that aspiration into political demand, distinction between need and demand. And if that is your hypothesis, there are 4 reasons why, as Farid Zakaria would put it, we have a liberal democracy. We have got NGOs. I mean, there are 3 million NGOs, and they're growing by the day. And one of the jokes on the subcontinent is that if you want a good daughter-in-law, you have to give her own NGO as a dowry, right? and I know 2 examples where that is true. It's not just a joke, right? In the old days, you had to give her her own flat so you wouldn't have to live with her mother-in-law and things like that, or get a green card or something. So today, NGOs are very important, and these are mom-and-pop operations, not these businesses like Oxfam, which is diversified into. I mean, that's gigantic businesses. I mean, they call themselves civil society, but it's I'm against big size, and they diversify into things they know nothing about frequently because they just want to get into everything and raise more money, I suppose. But the little ones are really doing fantastic work on the ground level. Then you've got a relatively independent judiciary that's, at the bottom level, it is really, there are problems with some of the institutional side. Then you've got opposition parties, right? Because people have been changing And then you've got a reasonably, this is what Sreenivasan should talk to, an independent press, right? Not as strong as you would like in terms of investigation, but you do have it now. So these 4 elements enable you to translate your aspiration or your demand into politically effective demand. China has none of these, really, as you know. Therefore, when it comes to things like agitation about takings of land and so on, immediately it gets diversified in India into political ways of responding to it. In China, you just go into the streets and have these so-called social disturbances. It's very hard. So so in my opinion, poverty reduction and democracy and a liberal democracy, all these 4 institutes, actually are providing you with an enormous shift, a kind of dummy variable, which is leading to a very different kind of demand for, which can only be met by reinforcing the strategy, which was, because we still, as Professor Panagariya said, we've got a long way to go still, a number of reforms. But this means we have to intensify the reforms, not back away from them. Then there are these people on the bus still, who now say, oh no, but inequality has increased. And that is really what is causing, the problem. Now, what kind of inequality? I don't know. I mean, it's a sociological concept more, and then the economics has to follow. And people on Park Avenue, like Rubin and Soros and all these guys, they're doubling, tripling, multiplying their wealth and their income. Do you think anybody in Harlem is worried about it? They probably don't even know about it. And 2, maybe they think, the size of the lotto has increased because they believe in the myth that they can actually make it, if these guys can make it. So this is a case where you have a widening inequality and no impact at all, which is what frustrates us Democrats actually quite a bit. Why the hell don't these people vote these guys out? They don't. I mean, they'll often vote Republican because they're not agitated about this sort. So all I'm saying is that inequality, unless it immediately appeals to, like you find that the president of the university earns 10 times the income that a professor does in English department, which is probably true. Those guys don't get paid well. Maybe there's a good reason for it. And so they get very envious, right? And so they agitate, right? But that's in the same place of work. But they don't care about what rural guys worry about urban guys. I doubt it. I've never seen, but maybe there's some data on that too. So inequality is a very complicated concept. But there I think just one thing that I would end on. I think one thing we do need, and I say Eileen Kaufman, from my good friend who does CSR. When you see these millionaires, some of them, when they construct these massive buildings and so on, it's not a good thing, because capitalism and globalization, which is an extension of capitalism at the international level, become more stable and viable under 2 conditions. or two alternative conditions. One is what I said about the American myth. Everybody has a chance at the unequal outcome. That, if I get less and you get more, and, inequality widens in that sense, I don't care, because I think I will be there one day myself. It's a myth, actually, sociologically, because there's no evidence that this is really true. But that's something which people believe. The other, of course, is that you have essentially, you don't indulge in that kind of consumption, conspicuous consumption. And so Simon Sharma, if you've read, his Embarrassment of Riches, I mean, he's talking about how the Dutch burghers basically accumulated wealth, created jobs and employment and so on, but they never spent the money on themselves. They were embarrassed about their own riches, and they spent it on them. In Gujarat state, which I come from, where the great Gandhi came from, there's a huge tradition of social work. And people, again, I've seen billionaires who look like, janitors, basically, in the way they dress, the tiny cars they drive, and all the money they make is put into socially productive things. They've done even dry farming experiments and all sorts of things, health, education expenditures. That makes the system viable. Now, if you get into a kind of wealth and a kind of value system where people actually indulge in conspicuous consumption, like there's one of the billionaires called Ambani, who is the biggest billionaire. He's building a 67-story building in Bombay, which has attracted a lot of attention. Now that's
$1 billion building.
It's $1 billion building. I don't even know what that $1 billion means, but it's beyond my range of experience. But that is where you really get into problem. And I think the corporations also have to wind up with sort of social responsibility in their own ways, doing large numbers of different things, of getting involved in the community. So I think inequality, even if it wasn't there, this is what you would want to do, and particularly if people feel there are unequal outcomes and they worry about it, then this is where you want to go into the Gujarat and the Calvinist and the Dutch burgher mode. Because if you don't do that, you can be sure things are going to be reversed. Thank you.
Now we'll have Professor Varadarajan make some comments, and then we'll take questions from the audience.
Thank you, Sri. I'm going to be brief. I'm not an economist. Really, the only reason I'm here is because I'm from India. And even that is, I'm not even I'm a citizen of Her Majesty the Queen. So that said, I've lived the emergence of the Indian economy at a personal level, as all immigrants from India have done. I left New Delhi at the age of 15, moved to England, and I remember, we have Indians tend to try and go home back to their families at least once a year. So I have faithfully since that point of departure gone back to India once a year. And each time I visited, these visits were basically massive gift-giving rituals. If you lived abroad and you went back to India, you basically took a small suitcase with some clothes in it and a very large suitcase full of cheese, chocolates, blue jeans, T-shirts, electronic goods. And then you haggled your way through the customs in Delhi, and you took it home to grateful friends and relatives. Over the years, I found my suitcases going back to India became smaller and smaller and lighter because people first no longer needed the clothes, then they no longer needed the chocolate, then they no longer needed the cheese, and finally, they no longer needed the electronics. They could get it all at a shop, maybe a 5-minute drive away from home. So going back to India now is actually a major challenge because, one doesn't know what to take people anymore. So that may seem like a kind of personal anecdote, one that is probably multipliable, a millionfold through other Indians' experiences. But I think it's a small but telling window on how India has changed. It's also, I guess, a window on the cultural dimensions of economic change. Professor Panagariya has focused magisterially on the economic arguments and data. But alongside the subjects that he addresses, and I think addresses better than anything I've seen on the subject, are dimensions that have come along in the slipstream of this economic growth, the political dimension of economic change in particular, both domestic and international. India is now, on the international stage at least, politically unrecognizable from the India that I was born into in the early 60s. India now at long last has a foreign policy as opposed to a post-colonial policy, which it really had for many years. It's a foreign policy based on achievable and observable self-interest, as opposed to a foreign policy that was based almost entirely on moral posturing. India's moved from being a country, thanks to economic growth, that was once respectable but inconsequential on the international stage, to being a country that was consequential, to being now a country that is arguably, and in the views of many, almost, certainly, a global power. I happen to think that it is a few years away from that status, depending on how you define it. But it is no longer the respectable but inconsequential place that I was born into. Of course, there are dangers that come with this. There is a kind of jingoism that has entered into Indian political discourse. There is a kind of ugliness sometimes to Indian policies on the global stage. And yet, at the same time, there is a kind of self-confidence. There's a kind of charming brashness about the way India identifies targets, and then sets out to achieve goals. You see this as both in terms of India as a state, or the Indian government as a government. You also see it as Indians as individuals, Indians as corporations. India and Indians, as a result of economic growth, have lost that somewhat kind of shabby shyness, that diffidence that once marked the Indian psyche. Existentially, I think India has been revolutionized by economic change. You see it at so many levels. Right down to the game of cricket, which was once owned by England with its headquarters in London, is now a wholly owned Indian franchise. You have, of course, this has brought certain changes to the game that purists like myself don't necessarily approve of. But it's an indisputable fact that India is now leaving its mark as a result of economic muscle that it previously didn't have on dimensions of international discourse and cooperation that are way beyond the purely market-based or the purely economic. Culturally, India is a force to reckon with. And I think that's one of the attractive things about economic growth. It allows for the flowering of for a new form of personality. It's led to literature. It's led to a fascinating array of newspapers and magazines. It's led to television of a most vibrant, sometimes vulgar sort. I remember growing up in India, we got our first television set, a black and white number, in 1977, when I was 15 years old, and it exploded and caught fire on the very first day we brought it home. We turned it on to watch a cricket match, and within 5 minutes, it was up in smoke, literally. And now I had an email from my mother the other day, just to tell you how things have changed and how, although inequality exists, how consumption has there are patterns of consumption that have emerged in sectors of society that previously could only have dreamed of them. I mean, my mother's chauffeur came home one day and said he was sick of his kids. They were pestering him to buy a flat-screen television. So he's going to have to buy a flat-screen television. Could we recommend one? And, again, this may seem like a family anecdote emailed from Delhi to New York, but it tells you quite a lot about how India has changed and how much more it's likely to change. I think on that note, I'll return matters to the experts.
If you would please line up to ask the questions so that we can record the audio. While you're getting your questions ready or coming up to the microphone, Professor Panagariya, any responses to what you've heard so far? And then we'll go to the questions.
Let's go to questions.
Okay, well, they're coming up, so. Oh, we're going right to you. He's given you a few extra minutes.
I used to hear quite a bit about...
Can you tell us who you are, please?
John Margoff, retired. I used to hear quite a lot about the military effect on the economy in China. I thought I heard in the past about the church, the religious institutions, control of some parts of the economy in India. And I always had images in my head of my childhood when the church and the military got control of the Japanese economy. I'm wondering if there's any reason to be concerned about the military and the church in Asia and in India in particular, from an economic point of view.
Well, I don't know if you would like to address that. I mean, we should also say, for those who are not familiar with the religions of India, that there isn't one. If you look at Hinduism, which is the largest part of India, of the Indian religions, there isn't one church that there's of Hinduism or one pope or even a series of popes. It's almost innumerable the number of options there, and then also there's a large percentage of Muslims in India as well, and then you've got all the other religions. So that's certainly where I would look at it. But
right. No, I mean, I think how the religion-wise and culture-wise India is so diffuse and so diverse that I was in fact having some trouble understanding the question. But this sort of fear, I certainly.
Well, maybe I can just think about it in a different way. What about the rise of Hindu nationalism? How does that affect any of the things we've been talking about? Maybe that would be a way to frame this.
Yeah. I mean, that is a factor. That certainly is a factor. You got both sides. Then there is large. I think large part of the Indian electorate really doesn't go for this Hindu nationalism, and this is in part perhaps the reason the NDA, which was led by the BJP, actually lost the election in 2004. But again, to turn it around, actually, in some ways in India, Hindus and Muslims really live together in great harmony. This kind of issue that you hear, for example, in France about the, covering the head and so forth. You can go in India, people are going covering their heads, or they're going and covering their, even wearing the burqas. Nobody really, this is not an issue. And in this sense, also, a lot of the explosions that have taken place in several of the cities, Delhi, Hyderabad, Jaipur, Ahmedabad, etc., you would have thought that this would polarize the Hindus and Muslims. Quite the contrary happened actually in my own hometown, Jaipur. In fact, the Hindus and Muslims both lined up to give their blood when a lot of the victims were brought to the hospitals. So I kind of see that a large part of the population really does live in harmony, and there is on the margin you got some
extremists on either
extremists,
side.
Yeah.
My name is Suyash Paliwal. I'm a student at the law school here. And let me first say that it is a privilege to hear such a rich and thoughtful discussion. My question is to the entire panel. I wonder if you could speak to implementation challenges that the government has faced in bringing its policies to light, specifically the challenge of corruption as a challenge that the government has faced, and whether there has been an observable decline in corruption as an impediment.
Okay. First Panagariya, and then we'll go down the row.
Yeah, I mean, this is a sort of theme, at least in the background, goes through my book, which is that the government in India is really, the capacity to truly deliver is really poor in India. And this particularly shows if you compare the capacity of the Chinese government to deliver and the Indian government to deliver. So in general, I think, and that's part of the reason actually in a lot of the areas, a lot of the arenas, I actually argue that, if we can if the private sector can be brought in, there are certain things that government has to do. It cannot get out of, education, health, etc. But even there, actually, to the extent that you can bring in the private sector, I think that's the way we'll have to go ultimately. On corruption, it's there, but I would say, it depends how you measure it. But if you really think in terms of however you define corruption as a proportion of the GDP, I would be tempted to say that probably has declined. A lot of the things that were being supplied by the government and therefore were subject to corruption are now being supplied by the private sector. Take the airline business, for instance. You got lots of private airlines. You don't have to go and stay in the queue. You don't have to go and bribe anybody. Similarly, telecommunications, there used to be anytime telephone. In fact, the Department of Telecommunications will actually do something to for your telephone to lose the dial tone, and then you'll have to go in and bribe the fellow to come in and fix the phone and so forth. So, but that's not an issue anymore. Also, in a lot of the areas, I think this e-governance, a lot of the things that you can do electronically, or computerization, that has also helped. Railway tickets, for example, if it's computerized, it's much harder actually to then rig the system. And finally, I would also mention, the Right to Information Act. I think that has been a very important development from that perspective. We still, lots of NGOs are using it effectively, but much more it can be used much more effectively. So perhaps one needs to do a lot more education also on, how to effectively use it. But I think that's a very important factor.
Professor Bhagwati, any thoughts on that? Okay. Well, I actually had the opportunity to interview Professor Panagariya yesterday on a Saja webcast that we did, and one of the questions that came from somebody outside was about China, and where does he compare India and China, and can India ever hope to do, say, something like the Olympics with, even if you allow for the lead time that China had opening up China long before India did. And he said, I think very interestingly, that India has the capacity. It's whether the government will allow India and the Indians to make that happen. Would that be fair?
Yes.
And
yes.
this is one of the things.
Yeah, what I had said was looking at that India, in my judgment, in most dimensions, is about 15 years behind China. China started a lot earlier than India did. And so the question President Sreenivasan asked was, can India do Olympics in 15 years? And my answer really is that, well, if the government can do its part, and not as much as Chinese government actually did, it can probably rely a lot more on the private sector 15 years from now than the Chinese government actually did. But if some part of it still government has to do, if it can do it, I think, in 15 years India can really actually host the kinds of Olympics that China did this year.
Okay, thank you.
I'm Ananda. I'm actually a student in engineering school. My question is, looking at some of the sectors in today's economy, most of it seems to be kind of dependent, in the sense that if you look at software, which is mainly outsourced, it's kind of linked to America's economy. Most of the automobiles are generated in conjunction with foreign firms like Suzuki, Honda, and stuff. But so Indian economy is not really an independently strong economy. What are the reforms? How can reforms help, and what are the steps? That's one part. The other part is most of the Indian talent goes into kind of sweating it out and not being smart enough. If you look at a number of youth who are becoming professors and who are becoming engineers, it's like we are spending more and more hours in companies, but we are not really solving problems in a smart way. What can India do to solve these kind of issues?
That's not my impression really. On your first question about, you actually want to be plugged into the global economy. You don't want to unplug from the global economy. Thank God at last we have plugged ourselves into the global economy, which is what has really ultimately began to give rise to the productivity increases that, I like to put it like this. Again, we are talking about cricket. If you want to produce top class, world class cricket players, you've got to play test cricket. If you say, I'm going to play first, in my school cricket and then only in Ranji Trophy, the state level cricket, etc., and then if I produce world-class cricket players, then I'll go and play the test cricket. You might produce 1 or 2 world-class cricket players that way. But if you're trying to look for large numbers, you'll not do it unless you actually play the test cricket. I mean, Sachin Tendulkar, you're not going to produce him without playing test cricket. And it's the same thing with entrepreneurship. It's the same thing with also us, professors, academics. If you are operating in the world market, competing for the top-class journals, then you really produce top-quality stuff. So I think the hooking up into, what you are kind of lamenting that, here, automobile, foreign firms are the ones we are competing against. But it's a good thing, it's not a bad thing. And likewise, when you say software, well, it's a good thing, because when we work with these guys, we learn a lot more. Demands on us to give quality product are much greater than domestically. I mean, you are too young, don't remember the kinds of products that I grew up with in India. You can't imagine, because there was no competition. We were not plugged in. And therefore, we were independent in those days. So you got the soap where, you weren't sure when you use the soap whether it's going to take off your skin. And lots of other stories. I mean, I'd like to tell a story of Professor Bhagwati is actually, when he came in 1961 to India. And this was, he came obviously from the generation who had been into the national movement and also the very much patriotic kind of way of looking at things. So first when he came, and this is before he became the free trader that you see today, so he sort of looked at, and wrote to his professor at Cambridge, Harry Johnson, who was also a trade economist, saying that, look, I don't understand, there is so much craze for foreign goods in India. It's hard for me to appreciate it. So Harry Johnson, who's very witty, wrote back saying that, well, dear Jagdish, if the quality of the paper on which your letter is written is any indication of the quality of the products India produces, the craze for the foreign goods seems quite rational to me.
Professor Bhagwati, if you could maybe tie this in with, the trouble or the turmoil that the world economy is having in America, and you see all the banks and everything else. I was reading, for example, that the Lehman Brothers collapse has had an impact on the Lehman Brothers employees in India, for example. And, a few years ago, there would have been no Lehman Brothers employees in India. So if you can just reflect, if you could, on this question of the connections, and I know you're in favor of it, but if you can talk about how India then recovers along with everything else that's going on.
Well, this is a decoupling problem, right? I mean, some things do.
You can just talk a little closer into the mic.
It's a decoupling question. I mean, sometimes decoupling happens, but in other cases, like the one you're mentioning, there's diffusion of the problem. It goes across to other nations. So, I think the only thing I would say is that I think when it comes to capital account and to financial flows, at least I think many of us have always been of the view that it is a dangerous thing in the sense that you do get effects which are quite considerable, like in this country also. I mean, the whole subprime crisis and so on, I think was, it was not foreseen, it wasn't thought through at all. I think the main problem, is with all these crises is that in the financial sector, essentially, a lot of innovations take place, and nobody actually develops a downside scenario in any effective way. Like you take the East Asian financial crisis, India and China were proof from that, because we didn't go in for the capital account convertibility. But the IMF was pushing all the time that we should go in for capital account convertibility. And the Prime Minister, who was the finance minister at that time, said, if I just told the IMF and the other people who like reforms and Wall Street and so on, that we were just going to, that we weren't going to do it, then he would be accused of being not for reforms. So he said, Indian style, very devious. He said, we're working on it. We're going to do it. And so on. It'll take a little time and so on. So the India and China managed to insulate themselves. And here were about 5,000 IMF economists who did not foresee, or did not work through how you needed a sound banking structure to be going into capital account convertibility. The LTCM crisis was the same thing. the deputy governor of the deputy, what do you call it, CEO of the
Chairman,
Bank for International Settlements, Andrew Crockett, told me 6 months after the LTCM crisis, he said he had at Basel a conference of the top central bankers and commercial bankers, and none of them knew what a derivative was. Now, I mean, so it had just happened with us. And Dr. Ackerman told me about the current subprime crisis, that he thought we were just going to, he's the head of the Deutsche Bank, and he's a spokesman for the financial sector, for the banking sector. He said we thought we were spreading risk instead we were, creating a dagger against ourselves, which is what happened. So I think in each case, the people don't think through. It's like the Iraq War. They don't think through the downside of whatever they're doing. And I think unless you do that, so it's, there's no point just having more regulation if you don't know what the hell you're regulating or what the problem is. So I think in each case, I think whenever something called a so-called innovation is taking place, you have to really think it through, think of what the possible downsides are. And actually, I was just telling, I think somebody, that I was reading Keynes in a letter to Kingsley Martin. You remember him, and the editor of the New Statesman. And he writes in a typical Keynesian exaggerated fashion. He says, the inevitable never happens. It's always the unexpected. I think this is a real problem. And I think on the financial sector, this is very much a problem. And I think we have been cautious. I think we are reasonably, I'm for caution and prudence on this. And I think we're probably excessively cautious. But now we see that there's some advantage in not just going with the flow.
Okay. Thank you. Next question, please.
Hi, thanks for the presentation.
Can you just speak up a little closer and speak up, please?
Hi, my name's Sidra Rahman, and I'm a first-year MPA student with SIPA. Thank you for the presentation. You were just talking about cricket, and I remembered that India is also, I think it has a 2018 challenge where they're going to produce a tennis star by 2018, right? Mm-hmm. Does anyone know about that?
Sorry,
okay.
Maybe you should speak a little closer to the
No,
mic.
I said that you were talking about cricket earlier, and I just remembered that India has a 2018 challenge where it's going to produce a tennis star.
It's going to produce a tennis star by the year 2018,
Yeah,
so,
2018.
this is...
Is that what we have?
This is
So
long-term
emerging giant
planning.
just adds to that. Yeah, and my question was actually concerning the agriculture sector. You said that agriculture only contributes to 16% of the GDP. So why not capitalize on the labor employed in this sector? Is it because of the inequalities at the international level, at the multilateral level, with unequal tariff structures or subsidies? Or is it because, why isn't India capitalizing on that sector?
What do you mean? Why doesn't India capitalize on it?
On the labor employed in that sector. Why, you mentioned that there hasn't been a move from the agriculture sector to the manufacturing sector?
No, but that's what you would like to have, that massive movement of workers out of agriculture into manufacturing. Mm-hmm. But it's not happening rapidly enough because the industry is manufacturing, labor-intensive manufacturing is not growing very well.
Yeah.
Like the manufacturing that's doing well in India is more capital-intensive, or skilled labor-intensive.
Yeah.
You got software industry, you got pharmaceutical industry, you got auto industry, auto parts industry, you got engineering goods, you got petroleum refining. All these are doing a lot better than things like apparel and footwear and toys and light
So can it not invest in the competitiveness of agriculture products, agriculture produce?
Yeah, but agriculture will not grow more than 4% a year. Even when agriculture does very well, it will grow maybe 4% a year. Okay. And you cannot get 9% in agriculture. So incomes will continue to actually be much lower in agriculture and growth much lower in agriculture.
Okay. Thank you.
My name is Mohini Dutt. I'm a first year at SIPA. My question is related to something that I'm writing for the web. This is about the food prices, the crisis with the food prices. What impact is it going to have on the Indian economy and what you were saying about the growth rate? And incidentally, did we cause it?
Well, we caused it only in the sense that we, improved growth rates has meant more income for people, and they're buying more food. So in that sense, it is it's not a blame or anything. It's just a fact of life, right? Like if a harvest fails, and your harvest fails, that's causing a price increase, like in 1972. So, is India responsible for it? Yes, in some sense, yes. But it's not really it's not a blame kind of argument. Indians got very upset about it, but again, I think when food prices rise, one of the interesting implications, of course, is that, and this relates to the subsidies, agricultural subsidies, which we talk about in relation to EU, US, and so on, and which Brazil has been objecting to as a Keynes Group exporter. The Keynes Group people have been very keen to use the fact, or at least the presumption or the fiction, that somehow if food prices increase, even the African countries, the least developed countries, will in fact be hurt. Because it's very nice to be able to say, here are these poor fellows, so they're also going to be hurt. So that increases a moral indignation about the subsidies in the US and EU. But actually, I think, as Arvind Panagariya has actually pointed out many times, about 40 out of 49 countries actually are importers of food products and of agricultural commodities. So when food prices rise, they're going to be screwed. And therefore, to pretend to these countries, as some of these Oxfam, etc., have been doing, that if that subsidies really should be removed, that's true only for like cotton, with the 4 African countries which are like Keynes Group exporters. But for the vast majority of them, you're actually misleading those poor countries, because a lot of them have wound up believing this. So it's better to face the truth rather than lie, and to say, look, I mean, there is this downside, and we will need special programs to assist these countries when we remove these subsidies. So there are this is the kind of thing, the distributional effects between different between importers and exporters. So I think this is India is what? India is a net importer of food? It's a mixed case, right? So some we are importers and some we are exporters.
Depends on you. Yeah.
So we are very schizophrenic about how we should react,
A final question?
Thank you. My name is Cynthia Roberts, and I apologize. I'm neither an economist nor from India or specialist on India. I teach here courses on international relations, security, and I'm working on a project on the BRICS. So my question is related to that, but focused on the Indian component, which I know not a whole lot about, more about the nuclear dimension probably than the economic dimension. And the question is really this. Given the financial crisis and given the shifting economic power, the rising power not only of the giant India, but in China, I work on Russia particularly, and looking also at Brazil. First, is there a sense, do you think, economically of community, lessons learned from one another in this group, and a challenge to particularly the United States and those Western powers that have established the rules of the road? This is not a bad time to ask this question when we see enormous problems on Wall Street and also huge reserves, financial reserves in Asian countries. And so I wonder, what are the implications, do you think, of the rising giant internationally?
Let's have, I know Professor Varadarajan has to head out, so maybe you can give us a thought on this, and then you can.
Was this a thought on BRICS in general, or in
I heard Brits with a T, so that's why I was confused. No, then I understood what you were talking about.
BRIC with a C.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no, I think BRIC is an acronym and not a community. It exists only for limited and contingent strategic purposes. So I don't think there's a sort of BRIC state of mind beyond the sort of obvious one. I think these are countries that have made contingent common cause for very specific purposes, and once these purposes are achieved or not achieved, then they'll go back to playing football in Brazil, cricket in India, whatever they do in Russia, and underage gymnastics in China. So it's just. But yeah, I'm sorry, that's a frivolous answer, but I think there is the Indian component of the BRIC is really only as it's an ephemeral kind of arrangement, and once it's 2 years from now we won't be talking about BRICS, I think.
There are many dissimilarities actually among those countries. When you really look into each one. So it's this Goldman Sachs came up with it, basically, and then it's sort of, you know.
It's a convenient tool to analyze things, I guess, is the thing.
To talk about them rather than analyze them,
okay. Professor Panagariya, final thought about anything? Okay. I just wanted to say that if you have any interest in signing up for the Saja mailing list, where we talk about a lot of these things in the events that he was mentioning, and looking at how the press covers all of this, it's at saja.org, or you can email me, saja@columbia.edu, or email me, and I'd be happy to help. But let's thank our wonderful all-star panel here. And please come up, buy a book, have it signed. I believe Professor Bhagwati's book is also there. My eyes are bad, but I think it's there. So, and they'll sign it for you. Thank you very much.